and the editors and the contributors of the Windward Review, for whom we are very grateful for all of their inputs, technical, literary, and otherwise. So we'll begin tonight with an exclusive, a significant reading, which in my opinion is long overdue. Janice Williams is the founder. She's the continuing heart of the Corpus Christi Literary Reading Series. Jan's also a talented, a gifted writer whose professional career has included the publication of many magazine articles, more than a dozen biographies, memoirs, and extensive work as a freelance editor. The very reason that the series has been able to get the awesome authors that we have over these 35 plus years the secret is that no one could say no to the pitch perfect prose of the invitation letters that Jan sent to those authors. They had to come after they read one of those letters. But the rest of the board and the patrons have not been able to convince Jan to read from her own literary fiction until now. So Jan's recorded reading will be followed by a live question and answer period. I encourage you to enter your questions and your comments in the chat section, and we'll see what we can get to. But first, sit back, take in the special treat of hearing my dearest friend Janice Williams read from her own works. Jan.
Wes, are you working on showing the video recording of Jan, or?
Were y'all not able to see that?
No, nothing came through.
Okay, let me try again.
Wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without a technical glitch. So now we know. Now your expectations are peaked even more.
Let's try that again. Let's see. Can y'all see this?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm imagining you out there in your living rooms, at your computers, and I'm grateful that you have allowed us into your homes this evening. I especially want to thank the hardworking board of the Corpus Christi Literary Reading Series, current and past, for the many hours they have put in to keeping this series relevant for 34 years and counting. Susan Hutchinson, Alex DeLeon, Mary Gleason, Jeanette Jones-Sosa, Susan McConnell, Susan Murphy, Mary Sherwood, Daryl Tanner, Dee Wimbish, and Joe Wilson. These are the real heroes of the series. Over the years, these individuals and many others have pitched in to help this unique arts organization thrive. We all owe them a debt of gratitude. In recent years, I have found myself thinking about the words we speak, about what can result from what people say to one another, as well as what we fail to say. We reach out to one another in words that can be awkward, reluctant, reassuring. Our words can also be inadequate. Since human relationships are rooted, at least in part, in conversation, it seems important to think about what we say in public and private discourse. Such deliberation can feel countercultural in a time of social media, when our every passing thought can be posted and read in minutes. Yet it's important to remember that our words have weight and consequence. Margaret Atwood, in her poem, The Small Cabin, asks, where do words go when we have said them? The stories I will read tonight take aim at this question. 7 adjectives, a short story. Morgan started it. There we sat at the cabin, all relaxed, just four old friends. Morgan picked up the Austin paper and turned to the horoscopes, reading everybody's aloud, but rushing through, blah, 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 the way she does. Hers was last, and she said, "Wow, listen to this. A friend who can see you clearly and relate an actual reflection of you is invaluable. You'll learn one of your blind spots." She looked up. "Lovely," said Regina, who was leaning against the stuffed arm of the couch, writing in her journal. "But isn't that self-evident?" It was our next to last day together, after a week at Trudy's parents' cabin in the Texas Hill Country. The four of us had been coming here for years, ever since college, when we were inseparable sorority sisters, and all of us English majors. Word nerds, we called ourselves. Now, having eaten breakfast and cleaned up after, we lingered over coffee. Trudy could never be still for long, and she started organizing books in one of the shelves. Conversation was unhurried. By this point, we were caught up with how everybody was. Relationships, work, plans. Naturally, we'd spent hours on the subject of Regina's twins, which made me think I'm never having kids. Too all-consuming. And anyway, it's almost too late for me. I'm 38. "Hey, everybody, that horoscope gives me an idea," Morgan said. "Let's describe each other. Seriously. Think about our word choices, be precise." "Are you kidding?" said Trudy. "No, seriously. Let's see if we can condense our understanding of one another to, I don't know, 7 adjectives apiece. Remember? A friend who can see you clearly and relate an actual reflection of you, etc., etc." I paged through a magazine and tuned her out. Morgan was always coming up with dumb ideas that nobody took seriously. She was always on the prowl for story ideas. She sat forward now. "Look, I'll take notes on the whole experiment and write an article about it. I'm telling you, this is a great idea. I know I could place it in a really good general interest magazine. I don't know, Texas Monthly maybe, or Vanity Fair." "Oh, please," I groaned. But actually, Morgan was building a pretty impressive portfolio as a magazine writer. She consistently beat the odds in terms of publication, and presumably, she was supporting herself. I was pretty sure she made more than I did as a high school English teacher. Maybe it was her background in psychology, but for some reason, she had an eye for what sells. Downside, though, she would use anybody in pursuit of a story. I love Morgan, but I'm telling you, she would sell out her own grandmother if it bought her a byline in a good monthly. Another thing, Morgan herself was in the middle of every story. If the piece was about a guy who makes high-end pool cues by hand, it would center around Morgan's memories of playing pool with the guys in the smoky, ill-lit pool hall of her Texas small town. If the story was about organic farming, you could count on a cute anecdote or two about Morgan's love of a well-cooked pot roast. Someday I might like to write too, because, excuse me, but I made better grades in college than Morgan did. If I ever do write, my stories will concentrate on the subject at hand instead of me. Morgan was warming to her cockeyed notion now. "Come on, y'all. It would be instructive to see ourselves through one another's eyes, and it could make a dynamite article. I'll split the fee 4 ways, I'm not kidding." She wore that gung-ho look she gets when she thinks she's brilliant. "Am I talking to myself here?" she demanded as Rudy, ignoring her, reversed the order of 2 books and slid a third into place on the shelf. I stretched to read the title, When Nietzsche Wept. Patty Griffin sang from the other room. Regina scrolled through photos of her twins. I remember those details, of course, because this was the day everything changed. The 4 of us lived in different cities now. I in Houston, Trudy in Austin, managing her family's trust. Trudy was married to Al, but she never talked about him. Morgan was single, based in Dallas, and traveled a lot for articles. Regina, the only one of us who had kids, lived in Alamo Heights in San Antonio, where she looked after the twins and behaved appropriately as the wife of Barry, a stuffed shirt the rest of us tolerated but didn't like. Regina had mentioned that she was trying to write in her journal about her dream from last night, trying to recapture the intensity of it, the color. She really did hate to be interrupted, always had, and now, with the kids, her whole life was an interruption. Even so, she put her moleskin aside and looked at Morgan. "Go ahead, sweetie, I'm listening." "Don't encourage her," I said. Morgan narrowed her eyes at me. "So, how about this?" she said. "We could write our adjectives privately and share them all at once. It would be fascinating to see how they overlap." "I don't want to think that hard," said Trudy, finishing the bookshelf and dusting her hands. "I'm on vacation." "Same here," I said. "Besides, it's a beautiful morning. Let's take a hike." I jumped up and headed for the bedroom. "I'm getting my shoes." When I came back into the room, nobody had moved. "Morgan, I don't think your idea is going over," I said. "As you can see, everyone is ignoring you. So can we just take a walk?" I swept my arms. "Come on, everybody." The screen door slammed behind us. The sun was high as we traipsed down the gravel road toward the hiking trail. Morgan hadn't dropped her idea, though. We all knew that. We walked for a couple of hours. Trudy could name every tree in the area: hackberry, live oak, Texas persimmon, ash juniper, mountain laurel, Mexican buckeye. As we watched a V of birds fly in formation across the blue, blue sky, I broke into the old gospel tune, "I'll Fly Away," and the others joined me in harmony, until we got to the third verse, which no one could remember. Morgan didn't bring up adjectives again until we got back to the cabin and started making lunch. You'd only do something like this with people you trust, people you feel safe with. She was slicing cheese for sandwiches, while Trudy spread mayo on Regina's homemade bread, and I pulled cold cuts, lettuce, tomatoes, avocados from the fridge. Morgan looked at me. "You haven't said much, Dottie." "I don't like it." "But the article would be about friendship, you know? About how real friends affirm one another." She touched my shoulder. I was quiet for a minute, trying to sort out my thoughts. Finally, I said, "Maybe there are things you should say and things you shouldn't say." "Well, sure," she answered, but then seemed to reconsider. "On second thought, no, not among friends." "But why an article?" I persisted. "What's the point of that?" "Well," Morgan turned her palms up in a duh gesture. "For us, it would be self-awareness. For the reader, I don't know, just a reminder that healthy people gravitate to people who build up the better parts of themselves." "Cheesy," I laughed. That night, however, after 2 bottles of wine, an endless game of Scrabble, and our usual unbroken chatter, she brought it up again, until finally Trudy said, "All right, Morgan." Trudy was sober, of course. She never drank. So we tore pages out of a pad and, following Morgan's crazy, stubborn instructions, wrote one name at the top of each page. "Include yourself," she said. "It'll be fun to see how we describe ourselves." We started scribbling, looking at one another's papers like kids copying in school. "Can we use adjective phrases?" asked Trudy. "Of course," Morgan said. "Put brainy for me," I prompted. "Hey, don't write the first thing that comes to mind," said Morgan. "Don't just write gorgeous for Regina, say. It's obvious, and besides, she already knows it." "I do not," said Regina. "Relax," Morgan said. "I just mean the idea is to learn something new about ourselves." "What if some of the adjectives hurt?" I asked. "Dot," she turned to me. "I'm genuinely interested here. Why are you so reluctant?" "More like cautious." A beat passed before Trudy said, "Dottie may have a point. Unless the whole idea is just to share a bunch of compliments. You so pretty, you so smart, you styling girlfriend. I mean, we love each other. We already know that. But the game had taken on a life of its own. I had begun to think in adjectives. Creative for Regina, loyal for Trudy. For Morgan, I was thinking manipulative. How had I missed that about her for all these years? Suddenly I could recall the many times that she had made decisions for all of us. What we were going to do, who was invited, the four of us, of course, but if one of us had made friends with someone she didn't like, that person would be frozen out. Now that I thought about it, this was a pattern, definitely. We'd always considered Morgan organized, a leader, and full of energy. Certainly back in college, that was true. Whatever the situation, she had a habit of stepping in, stepping up to the front, and taking the lead. The flip side of that was dawning on me as I tapped my pencil against my forehead. We were out of wine, so Morgan brought out a bottle of Maker's Mark. Trudy looked concerned. Haven't you guys had enough? But Morgan just clapped her hands and said, okay, back to work, everybody. Officious, I thought, and we lapsed into silence, closing our eyes and chewing on our pencils. Regina said after a minute, anybody got a light? We looked over to see her holding a joint between pointer and thumb. Oh my gosh, Trudy said, where did you get that? Regina shrugged. Barry. I was floored. Barry smokes weed? But he's so... Regina lifted an eyebrow. Yes. We all laughed. Even Regina. Tight-assed, she suggested. Well, maybe reserved, said Trudy, ever the peacemaker. Idonious, I said, with a chuckle, and everybody turned to me. Appropriate? Suitable? Look out, everybody, Regina said. Dottie's pulling out the vocab. We went back to our lists. The second time the joint passed me, I lay back against the couch, head spinning. First of all, Morgan, I said, 7 adjectives is too many. Really? Morgan said. You think so? Regina said, I was just thinking I couldn't contain you girls in only 7. There followed a discussion about numbers. 3 adjectives. 5. Finally, Morgan said, okay, at least 3 and no more than 10. 7 is optimal. You're so funny, Morgan, said Regina. And only use adjectives that are honest and precise, Morgan said. Eventually, we all finished after many scratch-outs, elbows to the ribs, and verbal low blows. Morgan collected our papers. Don't sign them. Let them be anonymous so we can guess who wrote what. One problem, said Trudy. We know one another's handwriting. Regina brought over fresh ice, topped our drinks. We slouched back in our chairs and faced the coffee table, at whose center the papers lay in a pile. Morgan reached for them, shuffled them in a mock official way. Then she returned them to the center of the table, face down. Okay, I'll just pick one and read the descriptions, she said. You can try to guess who wrote it. She picked up a page. This person lists, she counted, 5 adjectives for Regina. First is beautiful. She let out a puff of annoyance. Didn't I say don't be obvious? Anyway, the second one is sensitive, she went on. Hold it, said Regina. Do we want to stop and discuss these? Because I'd like to know in what way I'm sensitive. Suppressing a smile, Morgan said, no, let's just go through the whole list and try to guess who wrote each one. At the very end, after we've read them all, we can talk about it, okay? And so it went. Regina was kind, nurturing, patient, and sensitive. Trudy, tidy, logical, generous, and Morgan, a leader, goal-oriented, and say what? Funny, someone wrote, but I couldn't see that. As for me, I was smart, highly principled, stubborn. There were anecdotes and stories to accompany each adjective, So the process went on and on. Laughter, disagreement about small details, embellishments. Hours passed in a haze. What a gift to be so comfortable with old friends, to know one another so well. Eventually, though, we all got tired of the game, and anyway, we had to get some sleep because we were leaving the next morning. Can we crank it up here? Regina asked, looking at her watch. Just a couple more. Morgan picked up a new slip of paper and looked at it. I'm not sure what this person is doing here. Oh, wait. Her eyes scanned the page. Okay, she has drawn arrows. Like for me, she wrote organized. And then she drew an arrow controlling. I'm guessing she's saying a trait that is good, like organized, can turn into controlling if it goes too far. Am I right, Dottie? Hey, I protested. Rat me out, why don't you? I tossed a soft couch pillow at her. But yes, that's what I meant. She chewed her lip, nodding. Okay. And ambitious has an arrow to self-absorbed? Sure, I said, but they don't all have logical extensions. Aren't those the only two? Morgan was frowning as she shuffled through my lists. How come your adjectives for me are the only ones with arrows? She said. Well, look at Trudy's, for example. I described her as hospitable. What's the negative extreme of that? There's no extreme to carry it to, see? Morgan narrowed her eyes at me and I held her gaze. I said, I thought you wanted us to be honest. Yes, but, and her eyes fell to my pages again. See, you call Regina gentle. You can carry that too far, Dottie. You can be so gentle you're a doormat, and I don't see any arrows here. And trusting, a person can be so trusting she's stupid. Hey, Regina sat up. I'm not talking about you, Regina, Morgan said, never taking her eyes off me. Well, it sounds like you are, Regina said at the same time. Trudy asked, why is everybody getting upset? I thought we were sitting around playing a word game. And by the way, this is why I don't drink. What does that have to do with anything? Regina asked. Well, sometimes it's not so smart to let down your guard, she replied. People can get careless. With an exaggerated yawn, I stood up, stretched. Then suddenly, as if unconnected to my body, my hand shot out to grab the sheets of paper from Morgan. What the hell? She yelled as my other hand swept the coffee table, grabbing more pages. Before I could stop myself, I was shredding the pages, and then instantly, to her surprise and my own, I was scuffling with Morgan for whatever remained in her hand. We breathed hard but didn't speak. In fact, as I remember it now, the room was eerily quiet as I grappled to snatch the remaining pages and Morgan struggled to hold them away from me. After a stunned beat, Trudy yelled, Dottie, what are you doing? She stepped between us. Morgan, give her... With all the roughhousing, of course, everything wound up in shreds, and I scooped the pieces from the floor and the table. My movements were sharp-edged and determined as I wadded them together in my hands. I reached for Gina's lighter. Quickly, I ignited a corner of the pages and watched the bundle burn, swatting away my friends' reaching hands, shutting out their raised voices until, was it only seconds? At last, I smashed the pages onto the floor under my feet. By now, Trudy was crying. Regina, eyes wide, stared from Morgan to me. I gazed at the muddy, half-burned shreds of paper on the concrete floor, and then, as if coming out of a trance, sank onto the couch and covered my eyes with my hands. Trudy said, Dottie, that was dangerous. For God's sake, you... I'm sorry, I said. I took a deep breath, then another. I don't know what... Morgan, I'm sorry. She was gaping at me in shock. Me too, she finally whispered. Very sorry. The four of us sank into our chairs as if pushed by centrifugal force, and for a long moment no one spoke. Finally, Morgan said, "You were right, Dottie. Bad idea. We don't see ourselves as others see us." "Who said that?" Trudy replied almost shyly, "You're probably thinking of Robert Burns. Oh, would some power the gifty gie us to see ourselves as others see us." "Or Aeneas Nin," I added. "We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are." "That doesn't make sense," said Regina. Morgan looked at me and chuckled. "What?" I asked. "I was going to write pedantic for you, but I didn't want to hurt your feelings." "See, that's my whole point." I stood up. "I don't need to know that." All at once I was very tired. "I think we shouldn't talk anymore." I looked from one to the other of them. "I'm going to bed." I brushed my teeth and pulled on my nightgown, but when I crawled into bed, I couldn't sleep. I was wishing I could take back my words. I wanted to swallow every adjective I'd ever uttered. Not just those from tonight, but all of them. I wanted to refrain from judging, even from describing. And it was newly obvious that I didn't want to hear people's judgments of me either. We were all subdued the next morning as we packed our cars and tidied the cabin. "My head is pounding," complained Regina as she hauled a giant trash bag toward the back door. "That happens after a night of debauchery," said Trudy. I gave a half-hearted laugh, but Morgan was quiet. She and Regina would ride together to San Antonio, and Morgan would fly to Dallas from there. We all hugged. Awkward. And the two of them drove away, leaving Trudy and me waving from the wide front porch. We were packed to go. Trudy was about to lock the cabin and arm the security system. "Let me run to the bathroom first, Trude," I said. "I have a 4-hour drive ahead of me." As I walked across darkened rooms to the pine-paneled bathroom, I spied something on the floor behind the sofa. Leaning over, I picked up a slip of paper with my name on it. Nothing else, just my name. I stared at it. "Okay, Morgan," I said aloud and reached for a pen. Holding the scrap against the wall, I wrote just under my name, Jealous. Vindictive, I thought. Judgmental. I folded the paper into a tiny square and slipped it into the pocket of my jeans. Thank you. I hope many of you are familiar with the otherworldly geological formations that can be found in the southwestern United States. There are fields of them, and they're called hoodoos, and they look like the surface of the moon. This story ends in just such a place. All the hoodoos. Nora drove around the Albuquerque airport twice, then pulled into short-term parking and went inside. As she pushed open the glass door, she glanced up, and there was Cheryl, stepping onto the down escalator in the center of the building. As always, Cheryl was striking. Auburn hair piled atop her head and sporting an outsized pair of sunglasses. On impulse, Nora stepped behind a column to watch as her old friend descended, eyes scanning the width of the expansive terminal, looking for Nora. On the step behind Cheryl was her new boyfriend, if that's what you call a man in his 50s. Cheryl had a history of sorry luck with men. She'd made so many mistakes, in fact, and endured so many disastrous relationships, 2 marriages, countless boyfriends, some live-in, some not, that she'd recently made up her mind just to stay single. She'd called Nora. They'd talked. "Never again," Cheryl said. "I'm just not made for enduring relationships." After a couple of weeks alone, though, she went stir crazy and called Nora again, this time to amend her decision. Okay, I'm not getting involved again until you agree a guy is worth the risk. I mean, you're the only person who really gets me. What about your father? And anyway, nobody can make those decisions for you. I wouldn't even want to. Why not? Because I'd feel responsible if it went awry. Daddy has dementia, Cheryl said quietly. Sometimes he doesn't even know me. Her dad had been her champion all her life. He was tender and crazy about her, and maybe that was why she had such trouble with romantic relationships. She was looking for Daddy, a condition so common it hardly bears noting. Nora said, anyway, Cher, I'm sure I'm not the one to ask when you need advice about love. Not about love, silly. About me. Cheryl did meet a guy. Cheryl always met a guy. And now she was bringing him to meet Nora, who took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the column. Hey, she waved. Over here. They hugged. Nora, this is Chad. Cheryl put her arm through that of the tall man with his shock of blonde, gray hair and the weathered face of an outdoorsman. Chad, this is my oldest, dearest, best friend since preschool. Hello. Nora extended her hand. She wondered whether he knew the purpose of this trip. She wondered how invested he was in the relationship because, judging from her phone conversation with Cheryl the previous week, Cheryl was all in. He's so intelligent, she'd said to Nora. He has read in so many different areas. He's just infinitely curious and smart. How long have you known him? Nora asked. Long enough to realize that I really like him. Nora, I've been so happy with him. We do such... How long? A beat passed. 2 weeks, she said. But it will be a month by the time we see you. Chad insisted on retrieving and carrying Cheryl's luggage, which Nora guessed was a point in his favor. Also, he positioned himself in the back seat and let the women talk non-stop in the front while he gazed out the window. Another plus. How's the new job? Nora asked Cheryl, who had just been named vice president in charge of development for a New York nonprofit. Great, Cheryl said. I like the people in the office. Right, Chad? She said, turning to him. Don't I have nice people to work with? Sure. As they drove from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, Cheryl pointed out cloud formations, the red earth, and the light on the canyons to Chad, who'd never been to New Mexico. Nora said, those mountains to our left are the Janice, and if you look straight ahead, you'll see the Sangre de Cristo. Yes, said Chad. I read that the Janice Mountains are volcanic. Oh, there's the rail runner, Cheryl said as the commuter train passed, going south. Nora and Cheryl had grown up down the street from each other in Amarillo, and they'd been inseparable. They went to different colleges and moved to different cities afterwards, but they still managed to see each other every 2 or 3 months. Even though Cheryl had always lived in Manhattan and Nora was in Highland Park, Dallas, living with her rich lawyer husband, a man whom, she realized, after he left, she had barely known. Cheryl propped Nora up during those weeks after the divorce. As Nora tried to regain her balance and come up with a plan for her life, Cheryl cheered her on and listened and supported her and planned shopping trips and pedicures and visits to museums and generally behaved as a wonderful friend. As it happened, Nora had come to the conclusion that what she really needed was a whole new start. She decided to leave her job as an English professor and move to New Mexico. Now she was learning how to do pottery. She didn't have to work for money because Ron had left her well fixed. He was fair, she'd give him that. How I love New Mexico, enthused Cheryl. Isn't it beautiful, Chad? Notice the light on the mountains? Indeed, he said from behind them. Oh, and by the way, Nora, thanks so much for sending the itinerary for our visit. That gave me a chance to research New Mexico a little. Yes, of course, said Nora. You're welcome. The next day, Nora took her guests to the downtown plaza, and Cheryl bought silver and turquoise earrings from the Pueblo Indians sitting in front of the Palace of the Governors. This is the oldest public building in the United States, she mentioned, pointing to the governor's palace as they strolled past. Well, actually, said Chad, it's the oldest continuously occupied public building in the United States. It was built in 1610 and functioned as seat of government for the state of New Mexico for generations. Now it's a museum. Yes, of course, Nora said. I read about it before we came, Chad said. Cheryl beamed. Chad just reads and reads. I like to be informed, he said with a modest chuckle, his arm encircling Cheryl's shoulders. He's an intellectual, Cheryl said, like you, Nora. Nora demurred, but Cheryl wouldn't have it, and she launched into a long brag about Nora's time at Yale and her PhD and her years as a professor in Dallas. In the New Mexico Museum of Art, just off the plaza, the trio strolled among paintings and sculptures, pausing before their favorites, comparing colors and brushstrokes and commenting on the school or tradition of various artists. Cheryl had minored in art history, so she was in her element. They enjoyed the museum for a couple of hours and then walked across the street to a park bench in the central plaza, where they sat watching passers-by, women wearing ankle-length tiered skirts and chunky turquoise jewelry, young hipsters, wealthy Easterners drawn by desert mountains, Navajo men sporting buttons of hammered silver. Did you know, said Chad, that the museum building was built in 1917? Imagine what downtown Santa Fe was like then. Yes, murmured the women. Fascinating. The building itself is a combination of Native American and Spanish colonial design styles, he went on. Nora turned to look at him. You've done a real study of this area, haven't you? He gave a bashful shrug, and Cheryl said, I told you, Nora, he's so smart. In late afternoon, as planned, Nora drove Cheryl and Chad through Pink Desert to Rancho de Chamayo, a longtime favorite restaurant of hers, and one she had visited often, beginning when she was a child and her family vacationed in New Mexico. The first time they came in the late 60s, Nora was a toddler and the place was new. Best margaritas in New Mexico, she said as she parked the car. That's because their special recipe uses lemon juice, said Chad. No kidding, said Cheryl. I didn't know that. Over dinner, Chad held forth about Rancho de Chamayo, how it had been a family hacienda owned for generations by the Jaramillo family. How one of the sons, Arturo, had married a woman named Florence, and the two of them had set out to start a restaurant that prepared traditional New Mexico food. As opposed to Tex-Mex, Chad explained, of course the ingredients are different, hatch chilies and blue corn tortillas. Nora had 2 margaritas, 1.5 more than her usual, and thought about when she had first learned the history of Chamayo. It was for a school paper in high school. She hadn't mentioned this, partly because Cheryl was paying such rapt attention as Chad spoke. Oh, my friend, Cheryl thought. Dear friend. Do you know what the word Chamayo means? Asked Chad as they lingered over flan and coffee. It's from the Tiwa language, and it means superior red flanking stone, said Nora, with more of an edge to her voice than she had intended. Chad grinned broadly. Right, he pronounced. A few days earlier, when Cheryl had phoned to say that she and Chad were coming, she told Nora, just do what you always do, sweetie, and plan a fun trip for us. You're so good at that. Since Chad was a petroleum geologist, Nora thought he might like to visit some of the vast fields of hoodoos that dot the landscape in the northwest quadrant of the state. To that end, the 3 of them left early the next morning and drove to the remote Ashislepa wilderness area, located in San Juan County between Chaco Canyon and the Beastie de Nazan Wilderness. After bumping over a rutted road for miles, Nora stopped. There were no signs or outward indications of their whereabouts, so they were relying on Nora's memories of having been here a few years earlier. GPS was no help. She parked and locked, and as they set out hiking, Nora noticed Chad's shoes. "Didn't you bring sneakers or hiking boots?" she asked. "Wearing sandals, you might slip when we're headed down the breaks." "Oh, I've hiked all over the world in Birkenstocks," he answered with a chuckle. They walked in silence. Brown earth stretched out on all sides. The landscape was flat, the horizon distant and unattainable. "This looks like the Texas Panhandle," Cheryl remarked to Chad. "You can see for miles." "It's very empty," Chad said. "Just wait," said Nora, and on they trudged. "Are you sure we're not lost?" Chad said after another few minutes. "This is just a big field. It's pretty undistinguished." Nora didn't reply because, actually, no, she wasn't sure. Nothing looked familiar. Even so, she slogged on, her expression grim. So it was a surprise and a relief when, after a time, a vast fissure opened up in the earth to their left, a cleft in the landscape that seemed mirage-like because it was dotted with bizarre projections rising from the ground. Fingers of earth and stone, with bands of brown, ochre, pink, and tan, erupted on all sides. The shapes were varied and otherworldly. "It looks like the moon," Cheryl exclaimed. "What are those?" "The geological name is hoodoos," said Nora. "Same word as for the black magic practiced in parts of Africa. I'm not sure what the connection is, if any." "I've got to get closer." Cheryl set out at a trot. "Careful," Chad cried after her. He caught up with her and took her elbow. Then the three of them stood at the precipice as the earth sloped raggedly into recess. "Let's go down," Cheryl cried. As they did, Nora noticed that Chad turned to offer Cheryl his hand, watching out for her as they made their way into a far-reaching grotto filled with hoodoos, some of monumental stature. "They look so precarious," whispered Cheryl. "I don't see how the boulders managed to balance on top of those columns." "It's a matter of erosion," Chad explained. "The hoodoos started from volcanic eruptions in the late Cretaceous age. There's mudstone and sandstone, and then the wind and rain carve out these arroyos and canyons. Amazing." Nora smiled. "Excuse me, but do you live on Google?" Unfazed, Chad said, "Well, as I said, I like to be informed." For a long, quiet moment, no one spoke. They stood taking in the spooky shapes around them. All at once, Chad began slowly turning in a circle, seeming completely enthralled as he tried to soak in the mystery of this place. His genuine awe made Nora soften toward him a little. "The formations are just," he said as he came full circle. "Well, they're inspiring, aren't they? Mystical." "Yes, they are," agreed Nora, drinking in the view. It was late that night when they returned to Nora's house in Santa Fe, and they were all tired. Their plane was scheduled for early the next morning, and it was an hour's drive to the airport in Albuquerque, so Nora gave Cheryl and Chad fresh towels and wished them a good night. Then she went to the kitchen to make a cup of tea and think. What was she going to say to Cheryl? Cheryl wouldn't bring it up while Chad was around, Nora knew that, but she would call the next day, and Nora had better have her thoughts together because she'd never get away with lying to her old friend. As she stood sipping tea and staring out her kitchen window, Chad quietly entered the room. "Hi," he said, and she jumped. "Oh," she said, turning. "Need something?" "No, it's just..." She waited. "I can sense that we didn't get off to a great start," Chad said. "You don't seem to like me much." "That's not..." "I understand. I try too hard, don't I? He gave a little smirk. But Nora, I like Cheryl more than anybody in years. You like her. Are we in junior high? Nora said, and when his face fell, she sighed. I'm sorry, that was rude. Okay, use whatever terms you want. I'm trying to say that I'd like a real chance with her. Nora looked at the cup in her hand, but for a long moment she didn't speak. Why? She finally said. Well, New York is a hard place, for one thing, and lots of people are pretty cynical, he said. But Cheryl, even though she's had so many disappointments, she has this hopefulness about her. I like that. I don't know, it reassures me somehow about life. Nora nodded slowly. I'd like to see where the relationship leads, he went on, and I know you can put the brakes on it. I mean, one word from you and... He paused. And I hope you won't do that. Chad, you seem like a nice person, she said. Also, I didn't ask to be put in this position. Nevertheless, he said, and stepped back into the bedroom where Cheryl had fallen asleep on top of the bed covers. In dim light, he took a light blanket from the closet, gently covered her with it, and switched off the lamp. The next morning at the airport, Nora parked and helped Chad and Cheryl in with their bags. The three stepped onto the escalators and headed upstairs for a snack before departure. Chad, order for us, will you? Said Cheryl when they got to the coffee stand. She pulled Nora across the room. I can't wait to ask, she said breathlessly. What did you think? Seriously. Nora looked at her friend. Cheryl's eyes were bright, trusting. Nora thought of Brent, Cheryl's first husband, an alcoholic who loved to party and whom Cheryl had adored. And James, husband number 2, who never got off the couch and whom Cheryl had adored. And Nora thought about Alan and Theo and the long string of boyfriends and lovers on whom her credulous friend had bestowed affection over the years. Then she considered Chad, who understood something essential about Cheryl and who had the wisdom to be heartened by her. Cheryl, she said, do you really, really want this? I do, Cheryl said without hesitation. Nora took a deep breath and then another. Well then, she said, maybe you should give it a go. Thank you.
We will now take an opportunity for questions for Jan. If you have any questions, you can input them into the chat box and we will get to as many as we can. So thank you.
Let's see. Can everyone hear me? Oh,
I can.
Oh, okay. Hi, Jan. I know we met a couple days ago, but for everyone else's knowledge, I'm the managing editor of the Windward Review and a senior at TAM UCC for the English department. And I wanted to open up this discussion for Jan. I've got some awesome questions I'd like to ask her. But Jan, what an incredible reading you just gave to us. I just wanted to say, your voice adds so much to the reading, your own, your personal, welcoming, inviting tone, the inflection, the personality that you give to your characters in both stories. It adds so much to our experience as the audience, how we can relate to these characters and, just like an overall enjoyment of the story. So, thank you for taking the time to really add to your stories, I think. Yeah. Let's see. But to start off the Q&A on your work, I wanted to start off by asking some questions on the two stories. And as Wes was saying, if anyone has questions they'd like to ask, please leave them in the chat box, and I'll happily read them out for Jan. But are you ready?
I'm all set.
All right. I'm going to start with the most recent one, and then we'll go back to 7 adjectives, if that's all right. So, all the hoodoos, it's such a wonderful piece of character and emotional exploration. And I think you do a beautiful job of bringing us into these scenes, in the Southwestern United States, and allowing us to be there with these characters. But I wanted to ask, Cheryl and Nora have this really tight childhood bond, and such that Cheryl trusts Nora to make these important decisions on love and life for her, based on her extensive knowledge of her dear friend. And I wondered, have you in your own life, have you based this kind of experience on a close bond that you've had, or is this a writer's exploration of these close social feminine bonds that are born out of sisterhood and necessity?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that is the character of most of my friendships with my women friends. There's a trust. We're talking about the story, all the hoodoo, and there's I think there's somebody visiting me at the moment. That's my 2.5-year-old grandson.
Jan, you muted yourself. We can't hear you.
She can't hear you say you muted yourself.
Thank you. That's great. I can hear her, but it's I was saying, I thought that the theme or the thesis of that story was in that one sentence when she was saying, I'll never give myself to love again unless you think it's someone who's worth the risk. And Nora said, I don't want that kind of responsibility, to which Cheryl said, she said, I don't know enough about love. And she said, not about love, about me. So it's that kind of knowledge between women friends that seems to happen pretty naturally as you spend time together. And not just women friends, but somebody like that who grew up together, who knows each other, who knows each other's history, and also, that credulousness that Cheryl exhibited made her vulnerable in a way. So the fact that maybe she knew that and knew that Nora would want to protect her. But and also Chad, did he, tell me, anybody who's listening, did he win you over? He was such a kind of he came across as such a know-it-all, for most of the story. Did he win you over, or were you just impatient with him?
He won me over when he came back in the room and started talking to, not Cheryl, but the other one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nora.
Yeah.
Nora, right.
Exactly. Cable?
Well, I didn't dislike him, but I certainly know a lot of people like that. And what I recognized is that we each like different kinds of people, and it wouldn't be up to Nora to decide what worked in a relationship for
Right.
Cheryl and Chad.
Right.
But he could be annoying. But yes, I agree with Anne that when he came in and said, I want this to work and I need your blessing for it to do so, then it does change kind of the dynamic of the story.
Well, he understood something essential about her, and Nora recognized that he understood this sort of defining characteristic of her personality, and as she said, had the sense to be heartened or buoyed by that. But anyway, well, I'm glad he won you over. I thought he was very funny. I thought it was very funny the way he had studied ahead of time, knew the itinerary, had looked everything up, and then was trying to tell her about her home as if she didn't have any knowledge of it at all. And it was funny, and in the end it was kind of touching because, as he said, he tried too hard.
Actually, Jan, my next question is on Chad, but as you were saying about these, close relationships between people, how wonderful it is that Cheryl and Nora have this close, intuitive, protective relationship with one another after Cheryl's failed marriages and Nora's own struggles. But going to that later scene in the kitchen with Chad and Nora, you clearly portrayed Chad as this extensively read individual who, to Nora at least, at first comes off as quiet or even, cold in the opening scenes of the terminal. And in this scene in the kitchen, we see that he's this own person who has this deep intuition, sorry, on the relationship between these two women and, why Cheryl has brought him to Nora. And I wanted to ask, in this climactic scene, was it difficult for you to marry these two conflicting sides that the audience might have of him, and to make this one scene where the audience, they fall for him, they begin to root for him? How do you go about turning an audience's perception of a character?
I don't know. I hope that happened. It's just in the way I conceived of the character, and I saw his evolution and the ways that he was changing and growing, and also that he had more self-knowledge than I understood at first. He wanted to live up to her view of him. She thought he was so smart, and so he wanted to be so smart. And
do you think then that in the process of writing Chad the character, that he outgrew even your own expectations of him, from when you started?
He just kind of evolved. I mean, he became, he was going to become. I mean, I was as surprised as anybody, kind of at the ending. I just saw something from Tom Harrod. He said, it just popped up on my chat, and it said, Tom. Yeah, and Aline says, but he knew that he tried too hard, and that too, shows kind of self-knowledge. And the other thing, I think Tom said, I really liked Chad. Tom, where are you? I was going to see what some of these chat. Are you monitoring those, Dylan?
I am, but if you'd like to call out on people as well, that's perfectly fine.
I wanted to see what Tom and Aline were saying.
Some people are hiding out.
Yeah, you have to do video and mute again. But what about you, Marcus? Did you like Chad?
Jan, I thought the reason I started liking Chad was because Nora started liking Chad, and you wanted to. I mean, it was asked why. How did you think you turned people, from what was initially a cold reaction that Nora had to an ultimate yes, give it a try, was something that I know personally is very important to you, and that is for a person to live a self-examined life. And at first, he looked like he was just out there trying to impress everybody, and a fairly shallow person. But that later was shown not to be the case, and Nora picked up on it immediately, as she would.
Yeah.
And
well, so at what point did you think the narrative shifted?
Well, it was clearly when he came back into the kitchen.
At the end.
At the end, when he reached out to Nora, and then Nora started listening to his heart, that was more than just trying to impress her. I wasn't quite sure though, because he said I just want somebody nice in New York who's sensitive, you know, that doesn't get you all the way there.
No, I don't think that was what he said.
Uh,
What does somebody else think what he said? I think what he was saying was she's an antidote to the cynicism I see around me.
yes,
And to the, yeah, I
yes.
think it was more
Yeah.
that. And
Mhm.
It could have been just that he wanted that selfishly for him, but he really wanted it because he saw he needed it. And I think that's what Nora realized.
yeah.
The moment Chad puts the blanket on is the turning moment. The moment of tenderness, the moment of kindness unseen.
Mhm.
For me, that's the from where I see Chad as someone that I would like to know,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
opposed to
Mhm.
it all.
Well, he was tender really to her all the way through. I mean, you know, he carried her bags. He had the sensitivity to get in the back seat, let them talk. You know, he watched out for her when they were on the hike. So he was showing loving gestures toward her sort of all along. But that's interesting, Eileen. Yeah. Like Kay Bull said, we've all known people like that, and it's good to try to see what it is that motivates them. You know, it brings understanding, and yeah. Dylan, I don't mean to. What else did you have?
Oh, it's no problem. It's good to see that you're, you know, engaging with the audience, and you know
Yeah.
they have their own questions as well.
Oh, yeah,
But
readers.
I'm being told we only have a couple more minutes together, so I did want to ask a question about your second story, 7 Adjectives. Um, let me see. Sorry. So this is sort of a question in general about short story writing that I think 7 Adjectives is sort of a good example of. You know, it's one thing for the narrator to describe characters and influence our opinions of them, but it's another when the characters go the extra mile within the world, you know, to engage with one another and explore their own opinions of each other, covering these long histories like with the girls in 7 Adjectives that we, the audience, aren't privy to. So in these condensed narratives, you know, as a writer, do you think that there's a certain power in giving characters the agency to mold themselves and to tell these stories of each other, to describe one another and influence our own perceptions of them, as opposed to, you know, other forms of character development?
I don't know, Dylan. It's such a mystery. It really is. You need to tell the reader everything the reader needs to know, but nothing the reader doesn't need to know. And so it's finding those extraneous details that you don't really need. And as I listened to this reading tonight, I thought of several places that maybe I would cut. You know, or you ask yourself all the way through: is this necessary to build the character and to build the tension? And so, you know, the idea in that story was that. You know, they're a bunch of English nerds, and I know a lot of people who are watching certainly relate to that. And they love words, and they love describing things, and reading and writing, and so this is a natural game for them. Except that Dottie, the narrator, realizes that it's dangerous also. Um, and you know, she turns out to be right, but what they're trying to do is discover something through this conversation new about themselves. And at the end, the narrator did discover something about herself, or faced something about herself. Um, the horoscope said you'll find one of your blind spots. And you know, she very obviously did that. So it was a moment of self-revelation for her, and she grew and changed, I think, through that experience. But
I think out of the two stories, though. Oh, I'm sorry.
no, I was just going to say she discovered things, but at great cost, at the cost of
Right.
the relationship.
And I was going to say, out of those two endings, it is so powerful that Dottie suddenly, gives in to the power of the game, even its negative aspects, of that she finds this scrap of paper as she goes back into the cabin, and she learns, she writes down these things about herself that she would never think, or that she wouldn't want other people to think of her, as the game implies, that Morgan puts them up to. And it's so powerful that she accepts it, and that she comes to understand the truth, some of the truths about her that other people just might not be saying, right?
Yeah, I think so. That's how I read it. But yeah, I do think, it goes back to that, the sort of the theme of this collection of short stories, which all have to do with something that, the words that were spoken or not spoken, or spoken awkwardly, or spoken reluctantly or too late, and what the consequences of that turn out to be.
Like how you were saying in your introduction to the story, right?
Yeah. So I just appreciate so much all that you've done out at the university, and the review, and all of the technical support. I just really, really want to say thank you to you, and to Wes and Joe Wilson and everybody else who's collaborated to that. As I told Elizabeth Richter in an email earlier, Elizabeth and David were the very first patrons of the literary reading series, and have been supporters all along. And it's I said, well, tonight is a celebration of community and art, and I just really, really appreciate everybody letting us into your homes.
Well, thank you so much, Jan. And I think we're going to start transitioning to the next section of the night. But I do want to thank, you personally, you and the board, have done such a wonderful job with the reading series over its 35-year-long history. It's incredible, from your reading and these questions that you've given me and the audience, it's clear to me that you're not just invested in reading as an art form, but you're your own talented, well-versed writer engaging with the craft. And from your short stories tonight, absolutely exemplary of the kind of writers community that you personally helped foster here in the Coastal Bend, that you helped bring to Corpus through the reading series. And thank you so much for that. Thank you for inviting us, into your worlds, and for giving us this space, for helping build this space here in Corpus for us writers. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have to say again, all the credit goes to the board, past and present. They've done so much work. But thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.